What is up, guys? Welcome to the Meaning of Podcast, the podcast where we talk about your favorite directors and the meaning within their films. We're talking about a franchise this time, and obviously we had to get him on if we're talking about Spider-Man in any capacity. It is Mr. Hector Navarro. What is up, man?
Thank you, guys, so much for having me. I'm so stoked to be here. I really appreciate that within certain circles, I am known as a Spider-Man fan. So that's great, because I feel like I did something right.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, that's the first thing that came to my head when I heard that RB3 was able to get you to come on the show, because I wanted to talk about the character itself. There's a lot to get through, but then Sabrina came up with the idea of talking about the Garfield movies, and RB3 echoed in by saying, hey, those Garfield movies are kind of forgotten, so maybe we should talk about them. But first things first, Hector, what is your connection to the character itself of Spider-Man? This is a character that obviously has been popular for years, but I want to hear your story with Spider-Man.
I have a little bit of a backstory. So, we grew up in I say we because I am 32, about to turn 33 this year. I was born in 87. I grew up in an era in the 90s where the cartoons that were like the ones were Batman the Animated Series, and pretty much around the same time Spider-Man had a cartoon show. And when you go back and you look at that cartoon show today, it doesn't hold up as well, but it was very smart in that cartoon show was specifically designed to introduce Marvel characters to its audience through Spider-Man, meaning it would have a lot of guest stars with Daredevil and the Punisher and Blade and the Fantastic Four and an X-Men in a crossover. So that cartoon, I mean, for a 5-year-old kid, for a 6, 7-year-old kid, like it was everything. So I loved it, and that was my first real introduction to Spidey himself and to the Marvel world. And then my mom would take me to the library, and eventually I found a book at the library. I think I actually have a copy of it. Oh, snap! This book right here was at the library in San Diego. Shout out to the I think it was like the Orange Branch or something, but in Chula Vista, California, a suburb of San Diego. Marvel. 5 fabulous decades of the world's greatest comics, because this book is from the 90s and there's only 5 decades of Marvel comics at the time. But that book also taught me about people like Stan Lee and Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko and all of the different creators who worked on these characters, so that like when I'm watching the Spider-Man cartoon show and in the series finale Stan Lee showed up in a cameo, like I knew who he was. And eventually, all the movies and everything, like I was a huge Marvel fan by that point. So the movies being released in the early 2000s, when I'm in middle school, high school, it's like, it was the dream, man. It was, the movie Spider-Man with Tobey Maguire was a movie I literally waited for my entire life. And then Spider-Man 2 was even better. And then to the other great story I like to tell is opening weekend for the first Spider-Man movie. I went to go see it, and I still remember the feeling I had when like the opening credits were happening, because I'm like, I can't believe I'm about to see this, this thing that I've loved since I was a 5-year-old kid. And after that weekend, I went back to high school, 9th grade, I believe. And in my math class, 2 girls my age were talking about Peter Parker and Mary Jane. And I was like, the world has changed, because up to this point, these were characters and stories that nerdy, geeky folks were familiar with, but it was not as mainstream. And now there were teenagers my age who were not interested in that stuff, but became attached to characters, and not just like, oh, I saw the new Batman movie or the new, James Bond or the action hero, whatever, but they were specifically like Peter Parker, Mary Jane. And so I have, in between that time, from me falling in love with this character as a kid to when like these movies started to come out and I got to experience about all of that, I had pretty much already, it had been cemented that Spider-Man, and specifically Peter Parker, but I love Miles, I love Miguel O'Hara, I love all the other Spider-Men and women. But Peter, I have to admit, is my favorite fictional character of all time. So the Spider-Man movies are very up and down for me. There's things I love about all of them. Then there's things that I, just like any comic book fan, you compromise when you watch them and you go, okay, well, this isn't like the story, but I understand why, and it was a swing and it was a miss, and it was, I love this casting choice, I don't love this casting choice. And eventually when you get to stuff like, let's just get this out of the way, Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse is the best Spider-Man movie, hands down. Like it's easily the best one. But when I get to stuff like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, I really believe that it is it has such a good grasp on the potential of each of those characters. And when a character might not really work, I feel like the changes made in the MCU are at least smart enough and clever enough, and like there's enough in the change of that character to still make it work within a movie, but still kind of bring the essence of the character forward. That it's I watch the MCU movies and I'm like, I don't feel as though I'm compromising as much as the early 2000s, as the 90s, as the 80s, 70s, whatever, so on and so forth, when you see movies that are adaptations of characters that you're already familiar with. So, but I'm super glad that we're going to talk about the Andrew Garfield ones, because I have a lot of thoughts.
Yeah, it's crazy to think that your backstory is almost exactly mine. I'm a little bit behind you, man. I'm turning 30 next year. So I'm in that same bracket where
that's
the
Batman's
animated
age. That's how old Batman is. So you're going to be older than Batman, dude. Sorry.
Yep, exactly. But that I'm in that age group where Spider-Man the animated series was like the GOAT. It was incredible. I mean, it introduced me to Spider-Man, the genius, right? The idea that this guy can break out of any situation, not just using his Spider-Man powers, but his brains, which I thought was incredible. I always consider him to be, because Batman the animated series was around the same time, I always consider him to be the Batman of Marvel, where Batman is super smart and so is Spider-Man, I would say, and that's why I preferred Spider-Man. So I had that same upbringing when it comes to the Sam Raimi movies. That meant so much to me, watching that in theater, seeing that for the first time, rewatching it a million times. RB3 and I did a Sam Raimi Spider-Man episode, and we just ranted about how much we love those movies. So it means a lot to me. But I want to get to you, Sabrina, someone who didn't probably, considering you're much younger, grow up with that animated series. What was your first connection to Spider-Man or first interaction with the character?
Yeah, mine was the Sam Raimi Spider-Man films. And
Gotcha.
being introduced to that, I told you guys about how my father kind of showed me X-Men, and he also showed me Spider-Man. So it was a thing, because we would all get together as a family, some of my cousins and my uncle, and we'd go see these kinds of films in theaters. So as the Sam Raimi Spider-Man films, they are really great and they hold up. But at the end of the day, it's also this nostalgic connection I have to it. And it just brings me so much joy in general to be rewatching it, because it's something that we would do on holidays. And I just love the character of Spider-Man, because he's this like smart kid who is genuinely just a good person. Like, he really doesn't have a lot of cons to him at all. And I love the fact that he's young and everything that he stands for and what he represents. So that's kind of my connection when it comes to the character of Spider-Man.
Yeah, I'm going to toss it to you, RB3. I know your love of Spider-Man is deep and profound. Obviously, you dressed up as him a few times, right? Tell me about that before I get to my second question.
Of course. I mean, every time we talk about Spider-Man, gotta bring it up. When I was in dance, I was on the dance team or dance club in high school, and I wore a Spider-Man costume and did the Spider-Man shuffle. You know what I mean? On stage, it was an amazing time. Spider-Man's always been my favorite character too, honestly. Just throughout my entire life. Literally, the first movie I remember ever seeing in the movie theaters was Sam Raimi's first Spider-Man in 2001. I was 4 years old, and I actually remember distinctly running out of the movie because the Green Goblin stuff towards the end just scared my 4-year-old brain way too much.
For real? Wait, RB3, were you born in 98?
97, yeah, 97.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Y'all are babies. I love this. Also,
Yeah,
we're
and
both
Sabrina's
97.
even younger.
Yeah, we're both 97. Yeah.
Also, what did the Spider-Man shuffle look like? I feel like I need like a visual. Could you just potentially give us?
I don't think I remember. If I could do it in this small screen, this right here is my swag. Yeah. It was Spider-Man swag. I can't remember right now. I'm gonna show the video is gonna be here. I can't live down this amazing video. But yeah, honestly, Spider-Man's literally always been my favorite. Spider-Man 2, I remember seeing November 27th, 2004. When it was my grandma, Sia, and my grandpa Gene, and they took me to see it, and I remember that was always been one of my favorite movies of all time, still one of my favorite movies of all time. And then, of course, Spider-Man 3, I still remember seeing that. The Saturday it opened, too. Me and my best friend, Ryan Baptiste, at the time, we saw it that Saturday after it came out. at Paramount. I distinctly remember seeing all these movies. So even when they did the new Spider-Man movies, like I've always just jumped at any opportunity to see a new interpretation of it. I haven't been the biggest, if I'm being honest, I haven't been the biggest fan of the MCU Spider-Mans that much. I mean, I like him as a companion piece in Infinity War and Endgame and Civil War. And I even liked Homecoming a lot. I really liked Homecoming. Far From Home, just it wasn't for me personally, but I could see why everybody enjoyed it. But I totally I actually didn't mind the Andrew Garfield ones. I actually remember distinctly really liking the first one when it came out a whole lot. I thought it was actually a good, different but good interpretation of the character. And I personally, like, my personal connection to the Andrew Garfield Spider-Mans in particular, I remember, that was during a time when I was in high school at California Academy of Math and Science. I was very engineering focused, engineering minded. And the summer that this came out, summer of 2012, I was literally in a college class. I was a freshman in high school, but I was in a college class that was like machine tool technology. So I was literally like crafting stuff at
you
college,
Peter
like
Parker.
Stuff. So like when it was just so much fun going to the theater and seeing, because in the Sam Raimi ones it was biological, but in this one you actually see him tinkering with the stuff and building it, and it just kind of felt cool, like identifying in the character in that way. So I Spider-Man is something I've always loved and cherished deep down in my heart, and I'm excited to have this conversation with y'all today too.
Yeah, what's interesting is that was my follow-up question, RB3, was the idea of like following the Raimi movies, the weight that this new Andrew Garfield movie had to take on was really substantial, considering the fact that it's a big thing to follow, and the fact that Andrew Garfield, the casting of that, I remember, I might be wrong, correct me if I'm wrong, guys. I mean, it wasn't that long ago, but I feel like everyone was pretty much on board that I saw when it comes to Andrew Garfield's casting. But what really like sealed the deal was his Comic-Con reveal. I think it was Comic-Con. Mm-hmm. That kind of sealed the deal when it comes to like, oh, we got the right guy to play Spider-Man. So when it comes to the lead up of this movie, Hector, what was your thoughts going into this movie before you eventually came out of it?
The other thing that happened too that I think is very important to note is that in 2005, Batman Begins was released. In 2008, The Dark Knight was released, and Iron Man 1. And Marvel Studios came out and was like, well, we're going to do our own thing, and started to build out their own Marvel characters. And Sony had been, by this time, like the veteran in the superhero movie game, from 2002 up to this point. But seeing Batman Begins and seeing how audiences responded to that, and then seeing Marvel build out their own thing and obviously start building towards the Avengers, I think Sony had something in front of them where they made two decisions. They were like, first of all, we could do that on the villain side and potentially eventually build up to the villain team up, the Sinister Six. And we don't even need any other Marvel characters. We can do that on our own. Secondly, look at the way that Christian Bale was embraced as Batman. Look at the way that movie was made, the Christopher Nolan approach to Batman mythos, and everything started to shift with superhero movies in terms of like, in the early 2000s, I think there were escapism. The first Spider-Man movie is clearly a post 9/11 response to, let's not even address it. Let's just make a great kids movie. Let's make a movie that the audiences of all ages can enjoy, and we're going to pay respect and tribute to New Yorkers. And you mess with one of us, you mess with all of us. We're New Yorkers. It's like it's not only that too, but also the decision to. And I mean, it was really smart on their end. They got Sam Raimi, who was this this horror guy, and he had done a movie called The Gift with J.K. Simmons and Katie Holmes and stuff like that, and it was very like psychological thriller type of a thing. And I think they picked the right guy, Sam Raimi, but he also he tuned into the Spider-Man era that was like the 60s. He tuned right into that Silver Age, and he's like, I want to do a movie in the vein of Richard Donner's first Superman movie. He was not trying to do a movie set in our world. He's doing a movie, and his 3 movies are really specifically like, there's not a whole lot of cell phone usage. There's not a whole lot of, we're talking about real current events. It's kind of out of time, this movie. It's kind of timeless, but it's very sort of 60s, which is why when he gets to Spider-Man 3, like Venom doesn't mesh with that Raimi obviously wanted to do the Sandman, and then the studio's like, but also do this 80s character. And he's like, frankly, I don't get that. I'm not into that. So I think that Sony, and then also, let's be real, instead of making Spider-Man 4 and trying to kind of bounce back from Spider-Man 3 and how that was received, and also pay everybody like what they would be owed to do Spider-Man 4, they're like, instead of paying Toby this, we could pay this new guy this and save money. But I think that all of those decisions led to them being like, let's just reboot it. That's the simplest thing. How I felt about it leading up to it was I was very, very interested to see how this movie franchise could frankly keep up. Because like I said, the Sam Raimi movies, they were from a different time. I could not picture a world where, I'll say this, I can't picture a world where the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies, as great and as corny in a good way and as exciting as they are, could ever, like, if that movie series had kept going, let's do that thought experiment for a second. If that movie series had just kept going and we were on Spider-Man 9, Spider-Man 10, Spider-Man 11, could you see that Tobey Maguire, Peter Parker just crossing over with the Marvel Cinematic Universe and meeting Robert Downey? Like, no, it does not fit. It does not fit. This is how I will sum up the Amazing Spider-Man 2 movies. And I truly believe this. I think that overall, they get Spider-Man and Peter mostly right, with a couple of story issues here and there. But I think that the depiction of Peter Parker is so strong that I truly believe that if those movies had, from the ground up, changed the villain stuff, the bad guy, the supervillain plots for each of those two movies, that the Amazing Spider-Man 1, I mean, it's easy to say. If this movie was fundamentally different, 50% of it was different and better. But if The Amazing Spider-Man had kept everything the same except made the stuff with the lizard way better, and if The Amazing Spider-Man 2 had kept everything the same except made stuff with Electro and the new Goblin character way better, I honestly think that there was a version of those movies that if they had kept going, that the MCU would have been like, all right, we'll just have Andrew come over. Instead of from the ground up being like, we need a new character, we need a new kid, we need to, I think that, and I remember too, there was a rumor in 2011, 2012 that the Amazing Spider-Man Sony folks almost had the Avengers building from the first Avengers movie, because those movies both came out in 2012. They almost put the Avengers Tony Stark building, Stark Tower, in their movie. And it came down to, it was a scheduling thing where they couldn't get the assets. It wasn't somebody pumping the brakes on that and being like, hey, don't do this. It came down to like they couldn't get the assets in time, which is mind-blowing to me that they were this close to doing a potential seed planting crossover-y thing. So I think that the world that the Amazing Spider-Man movies live and breathe in is closer to where superhero movies are today. I mean, the first movie was only 8 years ago. The second was 6 years ago. So that would make sense. And I think that the Raimi movies are, in a way, even further away from where they are. Like, the Raimi movies are closer to Richard Donner Superman. They're closer to, and I kind of feel the same way about the Tim Burton Batmans. Like, they're awesome for what they are. And I think those movies are of a different era. Which is, again, why I'm like, what are you guys going to do with this Flash movie? How are you just going to have Michael Keaton just show up and act as though he's in a modern movie? He's going to be acting like a Tim Burton character. Like, this is going to be insane. It's going to be bizarre. Those are two styles that really don't match. So that's how I should probably mention this now too. I apologized in advance because I told you guys I was going to be rambling. I told you, Sabrina. I told you, Andres, I was going to be rambling.
Yeah, you did tell me.
I did tell you. Okay. Here's the other thing that happened. I was in the room at Comic-Con when Andrew Garfield appeared and did his.
Oh, no way.
I was there. I was in Hall H, and it was an incredibly powerful moment for me. I was like, I could get chills thinking about it. I remember what he said about the character, about his hand always being on his shoulder as a kid. And then they did this panel, and I remember being pissed because the audience never, when they did a Q&A, no member in the audience ever went up and acknowledged that Andrew Garfield did that. Like nobody said, hey, thank you for those words. Thank you for saying that. Or, wow, that's like so cool for you to show up like that and share that. It was all just like, did you do your own stunts? Like, it was like the dumbest Comic-Con Q&A. So then this happens in July. And then a month or two later, like in August or September, I'm living in Los Angeles at the time, but I went down to San Diego for Comic-Con. In LA, I'm in line for a comedy show at UCB. And in line is Andrew Garfield, and he's with somebody. It was not Emma Stone, but he was with a woman. But it didn't seem like it was a romantic. Like, he wasn't on a date or anything. But he was there in line, to see this thing. I assumed that maybe it was like an agent or a friend or whatever. So I tell my friends, I'm like, I want to go say something to him. And my friends tell me, under no circumstances can you do that. That's so embarrassing. Don't even think about it. And then they were like, well, what would you say? And then I told my friends, I said, if I were to go say something to Andrew Garfield right now, I would tell him, dude, I was in the room at Comic-Con. Like, I have loved this character since I was a kid. It meant everything to me for you to say what you said, and you should have gotten more love from the crowd, is all I would say. And my friends were like, dude, you should go tell him that. Like, you should go. And so I walked over to him. And and as I'm walking up, the woman that he's with was like so mad that he was getting approached. And then I was just like, hi, are you Andrew Garfield? And he's like, yeah, man. Yeah, what's up, man? Yeah, being super nice. And I told him what I wanted to say. And as I was saying it, his friend was like, aw, like I won her over. And afterwards, he was like, hey, mate, I really appreciate it. What's your name? And I'm like, Hector. And he goes, Hector, thank you so much, man. I really appreciate it. And then I said, have a great night. Congrats on your success. I can't wait to see them. And like at the time, my wallpaper was him in costume because that photo had been released. Like, here's the first Spider-Man, you know. So I was clearly excited for a movie that was a year away. It was coming out May in 2012, and this was 2011. And so that was my experience with waiting for this movie to come out. So I was very excited about it. And he was very nice. And then we both just were in the audience watching a UCB show for that, because I think he was taking a class at the time. And I had a buddy who was taking a comedy class who said a friend of his was in the class with Andrew Garfield. The thing is that apparently Andrew Garfield was treating it like a good actor, like an acting exercise. So every time he would initiate a scene, he would be like a dramatic scene, and everybody else in that class was like, I'm trying to be like a UCB comedian. So anyway, end of rant.
No, you make a lot of good points. Obviously, the fact that he was chosen for the casting was I think a lot of people agree that he was a great Peter Parker. And your villain point is so spot on. It's incredible because you think about the Lizard's entire third act, the plot of what the Lizard wanted. Electro, like, I'm gonna turn all the lights off. Like it seems like turning everyone into lizard people and then turning all the lights off are the two villain plots, and that's kind of like the worst you can get. And it's coming off the Nolan trilogy, which obviously had some of the best villains we've seen, not just with Joker, but Ra's al Ghul, Scarecrow, and Batman Begins. These are iconic villains that we create or that were created back in this time. So you're right. These are kind of made or broken by the villains. But Sabrina, obviously I want to get your thoughts on this film. By the way, Hector, I echo everything you said about Andrew. My brother, his really good friend of his, one of his best friends, was the stunt double for Andrew. His name is William Spencer on the film. So we've heard nothing but good things about Andrew. Awesome. And they were able to like hang out together and stuff like that. So that's my little claim to fame, where it's like a friend of a friend. But yeah, Sabrina, your thoughts on this movie, because I know that you actually really enjoy these two movies, right?
Yeah, well, I like them for what they are. I enjoy them. Obviously, there's pros and cons to everything, so we can get to those. I agree about the villains, the whole putting gas and turning everybody into lizards. I feel like the whole gas thing on the whole city has been done like day in and day out multiple times. And back in the day when it was more of that like campy comic book type of thing. And this was a whole different type of film, but I mean, I wish I was able to talk to Andrew Garfield and have a conversation, because he's one of my favorite actors of all time. So going into this, I was really excited to see him play this character, because I knew that he had a personal connection from all the Comic-Con stuff. It was great to see the love that happened on Twitter and came out online with everything that happened. But yeah, I enjoy this film for what it is. There's a little bit, tonally, is a little bit of an issue here and there. There are moments with him and Gwen Stacy that I enjoy, and then there's some where I'm like, okay, this is a completely different film that isn't really fitting in with the whole. I like the incorporation of Gwen Stacy as a character, because one of my biggest issues with comic book films is when there's like a damsel in distress, and Gwen Stacy is not that. She actually holds her own in a lot of the scenes, and so I really enjoyed seeing that on screen. You know, she's smart, she's witty, but their chemistry is so great, obviously, because they were dating in real life. But it's almost a little too much in certain scenes. Like, it's almost where they're not awkward high school kids. They actually seem like grown adults who are really good at like flirting with each other, and that's not how it is. So I think we miss kind of a little bit of that like awkward high school aspect. But I actually enjoy a lot about Andrew Garfield's Peter Parker. I like that he's kind of this more like alternative type of like indie kid at school. He's skateboarding around, the way he dresses, the music that he's listening to, the posters on his wall. I liked a lot of that because it was kind of like, because kind of like what Hector said, nowadays it's not at school if someone's like really smart, they're not necessarily a nerd. If someone's into comic books, they're not necessarily a nerd. You can be considered an outsider and an outcast for a bunch of different reasons. You don't have to be into that mold. So he's somebody who's really intelligent, second in his class, but at the same time he's kind of cool. He just doesn't really mesh well with a lot of the students at the school. So I like that they changed it a little bit from Toby's. But yeah, there's a lot to enjoy. I'm excited to pick it apart a little bit once we get to that side of the conversation. But yeah, I really do like it. Andrew Garfield's my favorite actor, so I'm definitely biased in that way. He is he encapsulates like a bit. I mean, he makes it a little bit cooler to be Peter Parker. I'm like, I'd be friends with that guy. I don't know why he's like an outcast.
Would you not be friends with the nerdy Peter? Sabrina showing her true colors.
I mean, if he's Andrew Garfield, I'll be friends with him regardless. I would love to have a conversation because he's so intelligent and so smart about a lot. But even his Peter Parker, there's moments. One of my biggest issues, actually, and I'll bring this up now, is how much they focus on his actual parents and that backstory within both films. I feel like it takes it away a little bit from his relationship with Uncle Ben, his relationship with Aunt May. We're not really hit a lot with like those emotional beats because I don't really feel as big of a connection with their relationship throughout both of the films. But definitely judging on the first with everything that happens with Uncle Ben, spoiler for anyone who's never heard about Spider-Man in their life, spoiler. But he doesn't really, he kind of acts like a jerk, honestly, which is sad. For that entire thing, he's kind of being a jerk. So that's the only issue I have with the way they portrayed him. A lot of the other stuff I did enjoy.
Well, that's my thing. I was rewatching this movie last night, and I can't lie, the nerd aspect of it all. And you can have endless debates of what is a nerd and what is Peter Parker. Peter Parker has to be a nerd. He has to be an outcast. I get that. It's a different kind of nerd at Sabrina, where he's not necessarily the traditional glasses, waist, pants, all the way up, suspenders. Like, it's not super in your face. But the biggest standout to me is what you said, is like this indie rock kid who dresses really cool, has really cool outfits for some reason. That took me out of the movie.
Perfect
I can't
hair.
lie. Perfect hair. Well, I was like, I don't know if I buy this guy being... I mean, his outfits are way too like fly to be anywhere near Peter Parker. And the fact that it's been debated, and I'm going to toss this question to you, RB3, what you said, Sabrina, is Peter Parker kind of a jerk in all these movies? Like in both these movies, he's kind of a jerk. Like throughout the film, like even as Peter Parker, I was like, oh, I don't know. Am I hitting something, RB3? Because I've heard this before.
Well, I don't know if he was a jerk. Well, first of all, let me. I think what the answer to that question also kind of spins into what I was, what my level of excitement was going into the Amazing Spider-Man, right? Because part of what got me excited was not only Andrew Garfield, but was the director, Marc Webb, who came off an amazing romantic comedy, 500 Days of Summer, which, you know, especially 2009, 2010 seemed like the most groundbreaking kind of rom-com kind of movie ever. And then, you know, you kind of look at it in today's lens and you kind of think, well, it kind of maybe doesn't age the best. Like it wasn't maybe the best example of, you know, proper healthy relationship handlage and whatnot. So, and you know, a lot of that could be.
If I can interrupt for a sec, I think that that's part of that film. I think that when I totally have read it differently in different stages of my life. Mm-hmm. I read 500 Days of Summer in a certain stage when I was younger, and I was like, oh man, I feel for this guy. Oh man. And then a couple years later, I was like, nah, dude, he was in the wrong. And this movie lays it out pretty clearly. But I just think that it shows how especially men can over romanticize a relationship, that's not what it is. I think that's a common reading and then rereading of that movie 500 Days of Summer. So to its defense, I will say that I do think that movie, to give it credit, like you're saying, RB3, like it was pretty interesting and fresh and different and groundbreaking when it came out. And when people have revisited it, I know that they have, upon revisiting it, it's either like, oh, this isn't a great depiction of a relationship, or it's, dude, this is not even a relationship to begin with. They slept together. You know, she lays out what her sort of boundaries are and what her expectations are for a relationship. So I think that that movie is a little bit smarter than a typical rom-com, is what I'll say.
Yeah,
what I'll
absolutely.
say. Yeah, back to you.
I love that you guys said that though, because the first time I watched it, I was really young and I still was like, damn, he's a jerk, kind of Tom in the film
Oh, really?
500 Days of Summer. But
Oh.
also we know that it's self-aware, like they know what we're doing,
Mm-hmm.
and it's up to the audience to kind of interpret it the right way, essentially, and actually see what the film's about, which comes on rewatches. But RB3.
But I mean,
Yeah.
but you know, going into it knowing that was his, you know, at the time, 500 Days of Summer, one of my favorite romantic comedies, and then especially knowing Andrew Garfield and Emma Stone were in it, knowing they had a real life relationship, only added to like, oh, this is going to be super romantic, super cheesy. So yeah, they really leaned heavy into. Also, look, Marc Webb did a lot of the great music videos, My Chemical Romance. Who else has he done music videos for? He Maroon 5, Green Day, like some of the best like music videos of all time. So it's like you kind of know that like rock aesthetic was gonna kind of come with it. So I kind of, when I walked into it, I knew that a little bit was gonna be into it. I brought the nerd angle because I could kind of get like the photography angle of it, like especially in 2012, like. I don't think in 2020 everybody's a photographer because everybody, you know, like, you know, wants to be a photographer. Everybody like loves photos, loves Instagram. 2012, 2011, it was a little bit different. Like if you're like actually taking real photography, people were like, "Yo, what's wrong with you, bro? Just pull out your phone." You know what I mean? And now it's kind of shifted a little bit, but that's just how trends kind of go. But like he was kind of an outcast in that sense. I kind of got that angle of it. And I kind of got like the self-isolation angle of his Peter Parker too. The one thing that, you know, and kind of, I guess, piggybacking off Sabrina, if I had to go with, you know, my negative critiques of the character, I kind of felt like the one thing that it was missing pretty much when I first watched it was the lack of the poverty storyline that I came to be familiar with Peter Parker.
Yeah.
A lot of my comic book exposure and my, you know, exposure through the Sam Raimi movies and through the animated series has always depicted Peter Parker and Aunt May as in a kind of a hardship position, always at the edge of, you know, of staying, financially stable. And I felt like that was really missing. I felt like they really gave him like a more affluent kind of background, which I thought, you know, kind of lost a little connection to me. But
It's
That's-
definitely stuff.
Oh
that
yeah, Hector.
they sprinkle
Go ahead,
that
sorry,
stuff
man.
in there. You're totally right. They sprinkle that stuff in there, and I feel like it could have been. That's the thing about both of these movies. They sprinkle a bunch of stuff in there, and they could have hit a bunch of these elements a lot stronger throughout, while saying goodbye to certain other elements. Like Sabrina brought up, the biological parents, Richard and Mary Parker, in these two movies, especially the first one where they set stuff up and don't pay it off. It's so unsatisfying. It's such a bummer. And the answers that they give you for the second one, you're either into it or you're not. That idea that like Richard Parker was a scientist working for Oscorp, you either like that idea or you think it takes away from the everyman aspect that Spider-Man has come to embody. In terms of that like poverty thing, in terms of that being like middle to lower class economically, there's a couple of hints where like Uncle Ben, Martin Sheen, who's fantastic, and also Sally Field, I think, is fantastic as Aunt May. He's fixing something in the basement. There's a leak. They're like, we'll call the plumber. No, we'll do this. I'll pick up this part at the store and blah, 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 blah. Which also goes into like Peter being smart and Ben being kind of, you know, being able to fix stuff and being a handy, capable guy. And then in the second movie, after Ben's death, Sally Field, Aunt May, says something to like, I am picking up a couple shifts, you know. I don't like being at home and we can use a little money. And, you know, just because her breadwinner had passed away, Ben is gone, and so she kind of mentions that in passing. And if that's something that these two movies decided to hit harder, I think it would have made the movies better. I think at the end of the day, there's just a bunch of like understandable swings and then misses, and the swings I think also come from the fact that, for better or worse, Sam Raimi, the 3 Spider-Man movies that came before it, led to these two movies being different for different sake. It led to, and even the MCU stuff. I mean, for Spider-Man being as iconic of a character as he is, it still kind of irks me that as much as I love the Vulture and Mysterio and how they were portrayed, it still kind of irks me that this new Peter Parker has yet to interact with Norman Osborn or Otto Octavius or these other characters that have been villains in the prior movies. But I think that's why Sony or Marvel have avoided them, because they were in prior movies. And it's like, wait, this is a reboot, guys. What are we doing? How are you going to tell me that Curtis Connors, Dr. Curtis Connors, is as important as a parental sort of mentor figure as as potentially a Norman Osborn or an Otto Octavius? It's not really the case. They're taking some of those round pegs and they're squeezing them into square holes just because they're acknowledging, oh, we're not going to do what the movies did before. Oh, what did the movies do before? Well, they never mentioned his parents. Okay, well, let's talk about his biological mom and dad. But it's not going to lead to anything, and it just ends up taking time away from the strongest elements of these two movies, which to me are Andrew Garfield, his performance, the relationship with Emma Stone, and then Gwen Stacy and her sort of story arc. And Gwen Stacy in this, coupled with Dennis Leary, I thought was great. I wanted more of it. I like Dennis Leary as this sort of younger Captain George Stacy. I like that. And to the conversation of, is Peter Parker a bit too much of a jerk in these two movies? I get that, but I also think that Tom Holland, Peter Parker, is just the sweetest boy. He's just a sweet boy. And I think it's perfect for the age that Peter is, and that, in my opinion, I think that the MCU is going to milk like 8 movies out of this kid. I think that the 2 movies we've gotten so far are like the first 2 Harry Potter movies, and we're going to get to the dark stuff, but we got to wait till movie 6 and 7. And when fans are upset, that's like, oh, Tom Holland hasn't had to have the pathos. I'm like, there wasn't too much of that in his high school years. A lot of that stuff came in college and with the death of Gwen Stacy, and then beyond, and then Kraven's Last Hunt and all that other stuff that happens later. But Tom Holland's the sweetest boy. Andrew Garfield is the bridge between that and I think the Tobey Maguire Peter, who I believe is very much the early Stan Lee, Steve Ditko, like Wallflower. I'm a nerd. That's why I'm an outcast, which, like we've been saying, it doesn't really work outside of a context of like, you made a movie that is like pseudo 60s. So it's going to work in that, with people tripping them and like, get out of here, Peter, you puny Parker or whatever. I think Andrew Garfield is the in-between. And I think that a really important aspect to Peter Parker, though, is that he does fail and that he does make mistakes and that he is a normal person, unlike a Steve Rogers, who now we're all familiar with, like how awesome that dude is. He always makes the right call. Superman is the same way. Batman is like James Bond, where he walks into a room and he's like, I know how to do every single thing. I got this on lockdown. Don't worry about it. But Peter Parker makes mistakes, lots of mistakes. Peter Parker quits. I mean, the whole genesis of the moment is that, and it's really clumsy in this Amazing Spider-Man movie, but it's the thing of like, it's not my policy. He's an asshole to somebody, and then that ends up getting his uncle killed. And that leads to guilt, and that leads to. So I understand these two movies trying to show Peter being a bit more flawed, and it's just interesting how some audience members they're like, yep, I'm here for it, and other audience members are like, no, Spider-Man's supposed to be a hero, and he's a jerk in the beginning, and he's a jerk in the end, and he's a jerk in the next movie, and he's which I feel like I can kind of argue a little bit against, but I understand how people can see that.
Well, going off that flawed thing, I think the flawed angle, and I think frankly the more darker angle that they were trying to take the movie was also inspired by Batman Begins. I think even you look at literally the bad guy plot, the gas, getting to the sea, that's literally what Scarecrow was trying to do in Batman Begins. Like they're trying to do everything they can to make that kind of like refined comparison. I think getting the indie director who had an indie hit and prompting up to do the superhero thing, I think they were all really leaning on the trajectory of Batman Begins. But, Batman is a very different character than Spider-Man, When you lean into the flaws of Batman, it kind of creates this interesting, complex duality of darkness and mystery and detective noir and, technology. But then when you talk about Spider-Man, it's very much more like optimistic, very much like about community and the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. And that's also what I felt was missing out of it too. Like it didn't really feel like a neighborhood movie per se. It felt, I felt like New York, you could have kind of subbed in New York for almost any metropolitan city and it would have, it would have felt the same. So
They did shoot the first one. They shot a lot of it in LA. They shot a lot of it on like backlots of like Universal Studios and stuff like that. The second one, let me defend something about Amazing Spider-Man 2 for a second, was shot entirely in New York. Yeah. And even the stuff on like green screen stages was shot in Long Island in New York. And it's a bummer to hear the director commentary, the producer commentary, because they talk about how they make a joke. They're like, oh, the tax breaks are great. But the director and other people will be like, well, we did it in New York because this is so vital to Spider-Man. And they had specific, very New York moments and New York iconography, which is great.
Yeah, the second one definitely did, yeah.
You're totally right, RB3, right? The influence of Batman Begins comes in. And the tricky thing is that Batman has enough villains that aren't fantastical that those 3 movies worked. Because those 3 movies never did Poison Ivy, they never did Clayface, they never did Mr. Freeze, they never did any of the super-powered villains. You know, the fantastical villains. Spider-Man doesn't have any grounded villains. His villains are all wackadoo comic book stuff. So for them to be like, half of this movie, the tone is going to be like Batman Begins and the pathos and the drama, and the other half of this movie is a lizard. I'm like, you guys could have at least chosen, like, I don't know, somebody like the Chameleon, whose like whole gimmick is like he's a master guy. Something more grounded to fit the movie. But it's also very clear that this movie morphed from a script that was Spider-Man 4. That Spider-Man 4, the Sam Raimi world, was going to have Dylan Baker be the lizard and fully go lizard because they already established the one-armed Dr. Curtis Connors in those two movies. So it's so clear that it evolved from that script, and instead of like taking it down and being like, let's do a more grounded villain, it leads to one of my favorite scenes in the first The Amazing Spider-Man, because the groundedness comes from Andrew Garfield and his performance. He is a phenomenal actor in this. The death of Uncle Ben is outstanding. The way that he talks to Gwen is, I think, fantastic and real. The way that he decides to do his performance is great. Then you get to a scene where he has to go to, here's what happens. He goes to talk to the lizard as he's transforming into the lizard, and it's dumb. It's stupid. And he's turning into the lizard, and then he's like talking about it. He's a plan, and then he leaves, and Peter Parker looks, and there's a giant armadillo rat eating another rat.
Yeah, rat lizard.
Lizard. Then
hashtag rat lizard.
It's such a stupid scene, but then it leads to one of my favorite scenes. If this were to happen in the real world, Andrew Garfield's Peter Parker does then what a normal person would do. He goes right to Captain Stacy, to the police station, and he actually lays out the plan. And the way he's doing it is so realistic, where he's like, listen to me, he was experimenting on himself, and he somehow grew his arm back, and he's turned into a lizard. I'm telling you, he's a lizard. And it's a movie that's fighting with itself with that tone, because Dennis Leary is reacting to it earnestly, and he goes, okay, here's what you're going to do. You're going to go do this. You're going to go do this. And as Peter's getting dragged out, again, I think so much of the good stuff about these two movies, I feel like sometimes even comes down to Andrew Garfield's improvs, because it almost feels like Andrew Garfield is improvising as he's getting dragged away. Normally in a movie, the character would stop talking. Normally, right? But I feel like if it was written in the script, good on them. But if not, Andrew Garfield knows to be like, you just have to bring him in. Just bring him in. You have to do this because the city's in danger. Please, just talk to him. Just ask him. And it's so real that then it makes Dennis Leary be like, okay, give me everything you got in this Curtis Connor. We're like, it's such a bizarre scene. And that keeps happening in 1 and 2, where like a crazy, fantastical bullshit thing happens. And then Andrew Garfield as Peter Parker like reacts, and it's real, you know, and him and Gwen Stacy react to the reality of it. And they figure out how to stop Electro, or they figure out how to stop Lizard and everything. And it's just a wildly conflicting. Then you get to the MCU, Tom Holland. Again, why does it work in the Raimi movies? Because that world established the tone. Why does it work in the Tom Holland movies? Because he gets the benefit of stepping into a world that's already everything. The MCU is that you don't have to explain anything. And they still went out of their way to be like, Mysterio's not a sorcerer. He's using Tony Stark barf technology. Like, that was so smart to explain and to bring those characters to be more grounded, and the same with the Vulture. But the villains are the biggest problems in these two movies. And Andres, you're right. It either makes or breaks the movie for audiences. And for me, I can watch the Raimi movies, and I'll be honest with you guys, I can't get into the Tobey Maguire, Kirsten Dunst relationship anymore. I think it worked when I was a kid, but you watch it now and you're like, there's no chemistry. The writing is very bad. It doesn't feel real. It feels very stilted, and it feels very not of our world.
Yeah. It's age. It's like that 50s.
Punch 60s. Me, I bleed. I'm like, I don't believe that you like her or that she likes you. Like, what is this? But then Norman Osborn is amazing. Otto Octavius is amazing. Thomas Hayden Church looks dope as Sandman. Some of the stuff with Topher Grace, I think he does a good job, even though I don't think that character should have been in that movie. But Topher's great. Then I get to The Amazing Spider-Man, and I really love basically every scene with Peter and Gwen. It's the villain stuff where I'm like, this is dumb. Fast forward. I don't care. So that's how both of those movie franchises work for me. And then I get to MCU Peter, and I mostly love Peter and Ned, and Peter having a crush on Liz, and in the second one, Peter flirting with MJ, which I think is great. And the bonus is the villains are both good. Michael Keaton, Jake Gyllenhaal, good. I can watch every minute of those movies, and I'm pretty much good. So that's kind of, I think, my thesis on the Amazing Spider-Man 1 and 2.
Yeah, Sabrina, I want to let you jump in here.
Well, yeah. Well, it was because I've honestly praised this movie a lot, and I've revisited it a bunch since. Like, I don't hate on it. Just one of the issues I had goes back to something RB3 said about the like friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, and how I just feel like when going back to also what I said about like him kind of being a jerk. When Uncle Ben's death happens, he kind of goes on this like revenge spree. And that's what also takes me out a little bit from that, because I don't believe that something like this happens to you, and he has that whole spiel about like responsibility and things like that. And I understand revenge in terms of like Batman and all of that, but it just doesn't feel in place for Spider-Man, and that takes me out quite a bit, even though Andrew Garfield's like quips during those scenes are great, so I still find it entertaining. I'm just kind of like, I don't know if something like this was the right choice to do when he's just going and beating on all of these people, even though a lot of them are.
Yeah, well, I want to add to your point, Sabrina, real quick. They have this dinner scene right after Uncle Ben dies, and he's going on his revenge tour. And I rewatched this last night, guys. They ADR'd. That's 100% ADR dialogue. Because I noticed it where it's just the back of Dennis Leary, and it's Andrew Garfield, where he says he's just going after the same blonde guy every time, where he's going after one guy on this revenge tour or something like that is what they ADR'd in there. And you think about it, and you're like, yeah, Spider-Man he kind of sucks. He's going after like just blonde white guys, which again might be like, it's 2020. I mean, it might be the right thing to do right now, but but at the same time, I was like, man, this guy's just going after random blonde dudes. He's not really a hero. Dennis Leary is 100% right, and Andrew Garfield is coming off as a jerk in this scene. In my opinion, that's what I was like. He's just beating up like blonde guys with like.
And that's the biggest thing.
If they have a tattoo or not.
Yeah, and instead of taking this thing that happens to him that is obviously very traumatic on his life and using it for good and going after people who are committing crimes, he's really hunting down this guy, and a lot of stuff is probably like breezing past him that he could really help out with. And that was just the biggest thing, the fact that he hears responsibility right before Ben's death and then decides to take that and go, I'm going to seek revenge, instead of just actually being responsible and being the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man.
I think the scene at the dinner table, coupled with the scene that was supposed to be the big moment, and it is a scene I do love, is when he saves the kid out of the car. Because afterwards, the dad asks him, who are you? And he goes, Spider-Man, for the first time, because he saved the kid. The kid, he was able to inspire the kid, put on the mask, really beautiful moment. But then he realized, oh, I could be helping people. And I reunited this kid with his dad, and I lost my dad. And I helped this random strangers, and it kind of changed me. I don't think that the movie hits that hard enough necessarily. I also believe that the tricky thing is that Sam Raimi solved this problem by having the burglar fall out of a window and die. And in the comic books, Spider-Man comic books, the burglar is arrested. Spider-Man at least arrests him for the cops to pick him up in that initial origin story in the Amazing Fantasy number 15, 1962. And then we haven't seen that play out in the MCU version. So like there's kind of different takes on, and I understand that the writers of The Amazing Spider-Man thought, well, why would this kid, if we're not going to have him enter a wrestling contest for money? And again, why not? Because the Raimi movies did it, so we can't do that. Why would he dress up? Well, maybe we can start with he's hiding his identity. And maybe we can start with he gets out on the street, he's listening to police scanners. Why is he out on the street? Well, let's just have the burglar get away. After he kills Ben, the burglar gets away. That's his initial reasoning for Peter to go and find people. He falls down a building when, it's almost like a Batman Begins moment when he goes out in that initial suit where he's not Batman yet, but he talks to Gordon with a stapler. And like his first night out. And then he sees like the wrestling mask, the luchador mask, and then that inspires him to actually design it. I understood all of the reasoning in the script for why he was doing what he was doing, even the way that the costume looks, which is spandex, swimmer, runner, realistic. And it does feel like he could have put it together himself. But the filmmakers went back on that for part 2 because they realized that audiences didn't like that costume because it didn't look like Spider-Man's costume. it's such a fantastical world to try to bring it down to the Batman Begins line of thinking doesn't work because, as we've been saying, that's a different character. So we don't necessarily need to see Spider-Man, make his suits, sew his suits. Not that important. The MCU found a great shortcut for that too. Iron Man's like, here you go. Okay, great, fine. And then in his own movie, he earns it and all that other stuff. But like I was saying, I understand why they decided to do everything that they did. But I just think that those moments, if we're talking about these moments as not being as inspirational as they are, then they messed up at some point, and maybe they spent too much time working on other stuff, and they should have spent more time with Martin Sheen in the beginning. Let's get some great relationship stuff between Peter and Ben and Peter and May and sort of the post-Ben death. Let's get more of that. I mean, yeah. I also think that that movie brain that these producers thought, if it's a reboot, we have to do an origin. I don't think they even considered skipping the origin altogether. And now it's like that's the go-to, is to skip the origins of a character if you're going to kind of, we're not going to get the origin in the new Robert Pattinson Batman. We didn't get it with Tom Holland Spider-Man. Like, that's now the standard. But in 2012, I don't think that the movie folks that were making this movie for Sony had even considered it. And ultimately, I think this movie would have been, honestly, kind of incredible if it had been not an origin story, but we had flashbacks with Ben, and then it cuts to him already being Spider-Man, and then maybe he has to fight the Lizard. And it's just easy to rewrite this stuff. It's easy to be that guy, to look at these two movies and go, here's what I would have done, here's what I would have done, here's what I would have done. I'm trying to give them credit for, at least to me, understanding the core of Peter and Gwen, even if to me they got the sort of potential of characters like the Lizard and Electro and Harry Osborn kind of completely off. Like, I think that they use those characters completely in the wrong way, and it does hurt those movies. But I do love the scene where, like I said, Spidey saves the kid in the car, and I think it was Andrew Garfield's decision in The Amazing Spider-Man 2 to have a scene where he comes down and he helps a kid with a science project, that kid Jorge. And then at the end of the movie, that's the kid who shows up in the Spider-Man costume. And it's a moment that is cheesy as hell, you guys. But let me tell you, when there's a little kid with glasses, and he looked kind of like I did when I was a kid, and his name's Jorge, and Spider-Man helps him and encourages him. He's like, you made it. This is your science project, man, and walks him home. Like, this is a thing that has happened in comic books, and people have shared it, and it's gone viral because it's like the beauty of this character. And it was in The Amazing Spider-Man 2. Not a great movie, but those little moments are there. And then at the end of Amazing Spider-Man 2, when that kid stands up to face the Rhino, like I said, it's cheesy, but like, if I'm into it and I'm watching that and I get to the end of that movie, like, I can get choked up with the kid who stands up to that creature, and then he puts the mask on, and then the cops look up and they're like, good, somebody's going to do our job. Spider-Man shows up, and Peter says, you're the bravest kid I know, go back to your mom. Like, all that stuff works for me. And I just wish that both of these movies had more of that. And another thing I learned too is Andrew Garfield, while making the first movie, when he was being interviewed or something, or was doing behind the scenes, he said, they asked him, what do you want to see for part 2? And he said, I would love to see Peter be more happy, because that first movie is very Batman Begins, Christopher Nolan, dour. Like, there's not too many moments of joy. And the second movie has a lot more moments of, I'm Spider-Man, and it's such an escape, and it's awesome. But then I got to deal with my relationship with Gwen, and I got to deal with, the villains that are popping up. That stuff's fine. But at least there's moments where he's just straight up Spider-Man, and he's like killing it. So it's great.
Yeah, I want to finish up here on the first movie with the idea of, they did a lot of story changes, obviously, when it comes to the first film, The Amazing Spider-Man. The biggest one for me, obviously we can talk about the villains ad nauseum forever, because I think we all agree that it just doesn't really work and it doesn't mesh with the tone. But the idea of not doing Mary Jane, the idea of switching it with Gwen Stacy. What I noticed watching this again last night was the idea of the person that I'm into is also into science. And that kind of clicked in my brain, where it's the idea of me like dating a girl who's like really into Star Wars or like really into movies, where it's a different kind of relationship, where with Mary Jane, he doesn't have that whole, she loves science, I love science, we have this bond. But with Gwen, he does. So it's a completely different relationship in that. But the idea of changing the love interest and making it Gwen Stacy, Sabrina, what did you think of that change? And why do you feel like maybe that might be the most successful part of these movies?
Well, I think obviously we talked about director Marc Webb coming off of a, like a rom-com type of film. And then we get a lot of those moments with this, and that hits for a lot of people. But also just the character of Gwen Stacy, choosing her instead of Mary Jane, kind of goes back to what I said from the beginning. The biggest standout to me is the fact that she's not a damsel in distress at all. She's able to hold her own. I love the back and forth that they have where they're like, oh, she's first in the class, he's second. They go back and forth with that kind of stuff often. And I love that because it's just two intelligent people who have similar interests, and it makes sense. I believe their relationship throughout the entire film in the paths of life that they're on, even how they're both really great people when Flash is bullying the kid, and Peter chimes in, which is really awesome because this is pre-Spider-Man. So I love the fact that he did that and he wasn't the one being picked on at the time. It was somebody even smaller, because Andrew Garfield's a tall man. It would look ridiculous if it was him upside down, Flash was like sticking his face in food. But he's able to stand up for somebody who's smaller than him pre Spider-Man, and that's another reason why I like enjoy and believe his Peter Parker, is because he did this before he had the powers. He stood up for somebody else. But then also the way Gwen Stacy chimes in that. And it just shows that they mesh very well together. Their chemistry is on point. They have similar interests, and she's able to hold her own 100%. Like, she's just as smart as he is. She's, if not smarter. She's also like one step ahead, where she's like, oh, we need to go do this. All right, I'm going to grab this. She's brave and she's courageous. And that's what I love to see from a romantic interest in a comic book film. I love to see them being able to add something rather than deterring it by having to be like, oh, I'm by myself, like, save me as well. She's holding her own throughout the entire thing.
Yeah, Hector, the idea of not taking Mary Jane, of making it Gwen Stacy,
well,
which is a different character.
I am totally okay with it because, like I was mentioning earlier, I had become familiar with the history of Spider-Man comics and the sort of order of operations of his life in the original Marvel comic book storyline. So even when we get to the first Raimi movie and it's Mary Jane and she's the girl next door and they're in high school, I'm like, that's already, you change stuff. Because he does not meet MJ until college. He does not date her until college. And in the comic books, he's sort of dating around because, he kind of comes out of his shell a little bit, and turns out he's a bit of a hunk in the Spider-Man comics, especially when he's drawn by John Romita, who came in after Steve Ditko, and Ditko drew him like a nerd. And Ditko was kind of a nerd himself. And here comes John Romita, and he drew beautiful characters. So he drew Gwen Stacy. He drew Peter Parker to be this handsome young guy in college, Flash Thompson, Harry Osborn, Mary Jane Watson. They're all attractive people. And so I was already used to that sort of change. So in a way, to have Gwen appear first in this franchise, and if they had kept going, they would have brought in either Shailene Woodley or somebody else to be Mary Jane. And that kind of made more sense to me. But the tricky thing is, you guys still said it in high school. And I rewatch these movies and I go, I love these two actors, and they feel like they're mid to late 20s. Let them play mid to late 20s. But the movie people, they knew to try to differentiate from Raimi. They're like, well, we had him graduate in high school in the first movie pretty soon, and then Toby was playing college age. Let's have these movies take more time in high school. And I'm like, then get high school actors, but you didn't. Let them, play their own age. I was so used to the comic book Spider-Man that I grew up with was this era of Spider-Man where he literally looks like this, right? This is Peter Parker, and that's Mary Jane, that's MJ, and this is John Romita Jr. as an artist. And I was so used to Peter already being mid to late 20s guy, and a handsome guy and a charming and funny guy, that to me, that's who Andrew Garfield's playing, even if the story is like, he's still in high school. I'm like, no, come on. No, he's not. This is dumb. They should have, again, they should have skipped that thinking of like, it has to be an origin story, because really they're just sort of wasting time. And then you watch Amazing Spider-Man 2 and they cram so much. When you get to the Gwen Stacy storyline and the death of Gwen, that's something that like deserved a little bit more time, but also do not do that unless you have already committed to doing a part 3 where then you can explore it. If these movies, we're only spending 2 hours with these characters, or maybe 2 hours and 20 minutes, but the comic books have the added benefit of like, there's a new story every month. So when we kill off Gwen Stacy in Amazing Spider-Man number 121 or whatever, you better believe that now for months and months and months of Spider-Man storylines, like, you're going to deal with that. And that had an effect to those characters in that storyline. And so Amazing Spider-Man 2 is such an ambitious movie. And I do think that they bit off more that they ultimately could chew. And it's a bummer that a major criticism is you get to the end of that film and people go, oh, then they just rush and they kill Gwen Stacy, and then Peter can't deal with it. And then Peter gets back in the suit for that inspirational moment with Jorge, that little kid, and then that's the end of movie. and they're teasing a part 3. And I believe that if they had done a part 3, that honestly would have dealt with grief. That would have allowed Peter, the same way that this movie ends and it's like, wait, are they dating? This is kind of weird. The second movie opens and it acknowledges, yeah, you haven't seen these characters for a couple years, and we're going to tell you that it sort of picks up right after. So pretty immediately, Peter is going to break up with Gwen Stacy, which is like, it feels a little bit wheel spinny. You know what I mean? It feels like you guys only have, again, 2 hours and one major story to spend with these characters. Focus on the death of Gwen Stacy. Focus on the character who causes that, a goblin, to build that up and make that satisfying. And don't sort of spin your wheels and waste your time. And Amazing Spider-Man 1 and 2 do that, and I think it's because of that movie-making brain where the producers couldn't think of another way to tell that story.
Yeah, absolutely. It definitely makes the Amazing Spider-Man movies stand out significantly, mainly because of the idea of Gwen Stacy. But either way, guys, that is our conversation on the Amazing Spider-Man, the first one in 2012. When we come back after the break, we're going to get into the second one, the Amazing Spider-Man 2. So make sure you guys stick around.
This ain't funny, so don't you dare laugh. With the 4/5 divide you in half. You getting at me equals a club half. You do the math, take you out the equation.
Check out a snippet from our trailer review of Denis Villeneuve's Dune, available exclusively on First Cut. Enjoy.
100%. I mean, with the way everything's going right now, just judging off the trailer, it's so epic. It's so grand scale. During the panel, he talked about how it was all physical sets because he wanted to immerse his actors into the film. And I think by us seeing that on screen and seeing their performances in that landscape, I think it's going to immerse us into this world. I think it's going to captivate audiences in that way, especially because we've been so hungry for huge films. Like, this is the time when huge films are supposed to be coming out over the past few months, and we haven't really been able to kind of consume any of that.
Check out our new website on geeksofcolor.co/first-cut to check out our reviews, our videos, and articles that pertain to everything First Cut related. Check it out.
Come along, children. Now we're going to have a little music.
What is up, guys? We're back. This time we're talking about the Amazing Spider-Man 2. I want to start off by saying the obvious thing in the room, and that is we talked about tone in the first movie, but my God, the tone shifts in this one, considering that we have Jamie Foxx playing like a literal like bumbling Max Dillon. We have storylines going on at the same time that are completely out of balance with certain scenes that are significantly darker. That's the first thing that I told you, Sabrina, when we talked about The Amazing Spider-Man 2, is like, what is this movie doing with the extreme goofiness and like the extreme darkness at the same time? It's the most
rom-com, the extreme rom-com,
and also the rom-com.
It takes everything
it's so
from
bizarre.
the first one and ups that too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's completely bizarre. And obviously we mentioned that obviously in the first movie with Rat Lizard, hashtag Rat Lizard. I'm trying to get that going. But from that to like, again, Jamie Foxx's entire performance, and I get it. Like he goes from like the bumbling idiot to like this. I can't lie. That voice is so cool. That Electro voice is dope. I can't lie. And every time he speaks, a dubstep song starts in the background, like literally, and I'm like,
that's the other thing about Electro that I actually really like, and also visually, I think and let's get this out of the way too. I think that the visual effects overall for both of these movies hold up pretty damn well.
Can I echo that? To say that this movie, maybe you guys really liked it, maybe you didn't. I don't know, but it's really up to whatever you guys prefer. Upped like 3 times more CGI than I saw in the first movie. Like, my God, this movie is like 75% CGI. At least all the action scenes are, where I believe that one of the first action scenes we see like a full CGI Spider-Man pretty much the entire scene. And I was like, oh,
CGI, the whole.
Yeah.
Here's the other thing. It's a credit to Sony and their special effects teams, because they did some of that in the first movie, but I think it's very well blended. There's an entire scene where Spidey fights the Lizard in a hallway. The entire thing is
CGI.
The entire thing is CG, and the lighting is so good that it looks real. Like, the Lizard is CG, but even the lockers that he's being thrown up into, and the lights that he's crawling across, like the Spider-Man character, all of it is CG. You get to Amazing Spider-Man 2, and they set way more of it during the day, because I feel like that was another response from audiences. First movie, were like, the first movie's mostly at nighttime, and now you get to the second one, and it's bright, it's colorful. Also, I'll get this out of the way because I'm the only person on Earth who cares about this. The 3D in Amazing Spider-Man 2 is fantastic.
I echo that. I 100%
the 3D
echo that.
Do you have a 3D TV, RB3?
I'm a big 3D. I don't have a 3D TV personally, but I'm the biggest 3D fan. Andres knows this.
Dude.
Sabrina knows this.
Yeah.
I'm the biggest 3D fan ever.
When this quarantine is over, y'all are coming over to watch a 3D movie. It's dope.
Yeah.
But Amazing Spider-Man 1 has okay 3D and a couple of really highlight sequences. Part 2, I think, overall, I'll go to bat for it overall. I think it is so much more dynamic, and they really use it well. But I know that's a thing that only a couple people overall can experience. But special effects are pretty good. Here's the other thing, like we were saying, Andres. Electro, the score for Part 2. First of all, the score for Part 1, I kind of dislike. James Horner, at some points, makes it sound like Titanic. R.I.P. One of the best composers of all time. I think he was miscast for Spider-Man. He made a very personal score that was very, introspective and personal for the first movie, and it kind of didn't mesh. You get to the second one, and Hans Zimmer did something with like Pharrell and all these different musicians that feels way more bombastic and comic booky, and it's a little themed. It's like bum 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 bum. Like I can kind of hum a little bit, and the electro stuff, that dubstep stuff. I think it's dope. I've listened to this score while reading Spider-Man comics, and when Electro shows up and I'm hearing that Electro stuff, I'm like, this works. This is cool. This works for me. So Electro-wise, he looks cool, and the music is cool. Andres, back to you. Tell us about Electro.
Well, my thing is, obviously, let's talk about that fight scene that he has in the middle of New York real quick. The one that introduces Electro, where he's seen himself on the screens, and he's like, they can see me, and he has the hoodie up, which makes him look even more like the Emperor. I really wanted him to just go like, power, so bad. I think that would have been an amazing reference if even he was referencing it, where Max Dillon is like, oh, man, I kind of look like that Emperor guy. I think that would have been funny. But yeah, to echo that score, there's a vocalist in that scene. I don't know if you know, you might pay attention more than I do, but that vocalist is going so hard, and you can hear a vocalist literally going like, oh.
Well, I think it's interesting.
That was beautiful.
Too.
Well,
yeah,
that was
but
good.
it's one guy.
I was going to say there's multiple layers to that score, right? So like Hector alluded to, it was Hans Zimmer. But it was also a combination of Pharrell Williams, and I think it was called The Seven, if I'm not mistaken. So there's a bunch of people who actually collaborate on this, or I'm sorry, The Magnificent Six. So which also included Junkie XL, Pharrell Williams, and a few other guys. So and Hans Zimmer as well. So it was like a real collaborative thing. I personally thought the sound of the score itself was interesting, like the layers, like the talking, like the buzzing and all that too, kind of really was really, really cool. I personally just didn't like the combination of it with like the performance from like Jamie, because it felt like Jamie was doing like this whole like, what's going on? And he was doing like a lot of people make like the comparison to like Jim Carrey and as what was it, the Riddler and Batman Forever.
There's a lot of Schumacher Batman in this movie. There's like a lot of Schumacher.
Oh yeah. With the tenant when with the electric eels.
Yeah. What the hell is that?
Yeah.
What is that character?
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, they went full goofy with it, but I guess that goes to the changes you were saying, Hector. I remember seeing this movie when it first came out, and the cinematography was the first thing I noted. Right, like the first one, like you said, very dark. Most of it set at night. Emulating that Batman Begins thing, but then even to the fact that literally his eyes were black, like the Batman costume had black eyes. They went in a completely different direction this time around, but still kind of keeping that same actor, kind of made for like kind of weird expectations, I think, for audiences coming into it. But I think what kind of made this movie like so jarring is that like, it seemingly where the first Amazing Spider-Man felt like very like modern and very like 2012, like this one felt kind of more like in the 90s kind of comic book movie era than it did like more than anything else.
Again, you're right, and I was trying to figure out what the hell happened, and we're talking about tone. And apparently Mark Webb was saying on behalf of the people who made the movie that they knew they were going to do the death of Gwen Stacy. They knew that. So they knew that the Peter Parker Gwen stuff was probably going to be pretty real, grounded, eventually leading up to that, and heartbreaking. But Mark Webb specifically wanted more of a fun tone for the villain side. So I think that encouraged Jamie Foxx to come in. And here's the other problem, too. They messed up by picking Electro as the major villain because if you are familiar with Spider-Man comic books, Electro, even though he's a major character, he is never worthy of being a mastermind or the main threat. He is a guy who is very powerful. He's got those cool powers, but he always gets beat. Why? Because he's pretty basic. He's pretty simple. He usually has to team up with the Vulture, and they're just both career criminals. They're just guys who are like, I got powers or I have a suit, I'm going to steal shit. That's what their character boils down to. For them to look at that character and decide, let's just try to do something that's kind of like a clean slate because this isn't super compelling. That character, Max Dillon, is not the most compelling. He's not Norman Osborn. He's not Otto Octavius. He's not Eddie Brock, whatever. The problem is then I think they made choices. They encouraged Jamie Foxx to like find a character, and they went full silly, zany with it. And they made the mistake of making him sympathetic. That character should not be sympathetic. That character, Electro, is just, again, he's kind of like Adrian Toomes, the Vulture. He's like Michael Keaton, Vulture. How is Michael Keaton sympathetic? Because he loses jobs. But then he steals a bunch of stuff. And he continues to do that, and then he gains sympathy again at the end when you find out he has a family, but then you're still like, dude, why are you doing this? You have a family. Like, it's a great thing that they gave that character but kept it to the core. And Mysterio is also not sympathetic, or at least he was to begin with, and then we were fooled, and that's how you're able to build some kind of interest in that character. But Electro is such a basic character. For them to be like, Jamie, just kind of do whatever you want. They took some swings, and I think that they made a character that they thought would be memorable. And ultimately, it's really silly, and it takes you out of it. And I understand that most Spider-Man villains have a level of sympathy with them. Electro's like the one that doesn't. Even Rhino is more sympathetic because Rhino is just this big, dumb guy who then gets put into a suit, and in the various versions of the story, the suit is stuck on there permanently, and then Rhino's like, I'm a freak, I can't get out. Like, that's your sympathy, built-in sympathy, you know? So that was their mistake, and the other mistake,
You know what it is, man? I really feel like as I was rewatching this movie, I was like, I think I know what was happening. I think someone was like, hey, wouldn't it be really cool to see electric powers and to see Spider-Man dodging electricity? I think they wanted to put this crazy electrical fireworks show when it comes to the CGI action scenes. I think that's what they wanted. I think they saw 2009's Watchmen, and they're like, that Dr. Manhattan looks really cool. Let's do Dr. Manhattan. Literally a scene where he breaks himself apart and he builds himself back together, and he's basically naked in front of Dane DeHaan's Osborn.
Absolutely.
And I was like, wait a minute. Dr. Manhattan, is that you? Like, it really did feel like that's what they wanted to do. They wanted to do like this crazy CGI fest.
How much cooler would it have been if they let Jamie Foxx be menacing and real and a threat from the beginning? If he never played a nerdy Max, but if it was just slick, cool, regular bald Jamie Foxx, who's like one of the
with that voice,
most charismatic with that voice, and then let his evolution into Electro be a thing that happens over time. Because like the blue skin Electro is typically seen in, let me see if I might have it right here. I actually have it right here. Boom, baby. It's typically seen in Ultimate Spider-Man, which we've seen a lot of movies reference this because it's very cinematic, this version of Spider-Man. And there's your Electro right there. Boom, that's what it is. But normally Electro in the comic books, he still looks like a normal dude. And he's got that really dumb yellow mask that's like a star thing that pops out. I don't need to see that. But I'm saying let Jamie be Jamie, and then maybe he doesn't turn blue like an energy being until like Act 3. You know what I mean? Like if he were just like this badass black dude, and he could have stayed that black dude and was fighting Spider-Man with those powers shooting out of him. I just think that it was just a huge missed opportunity that somewhere along the line, either Jamie Foxx or somebody was like, do a character. And he was like, okay, this will be fun. And instead, it's really dumb and silly.
Well, I feel like they didn't dedicate any to his arc, right? Like, I felt like his arc literally happened all in one scene. Like, it was like he meets Spider-Man, and then he's like, oh, I'm a big fan. And then, boom, he moves on. And then the very next scene, we see him. He runs into Spider-Man again. And he's like, oh, Spider-Man, you don't remember me? And then Spider-Man's like, yeah, I kind of remember you, maybe. And, like, that trick, like, that little bit trigger, like, how can you expect Spider-Man to remember every single person he meets every single day. Like, what is wrong with you? Like, it gave me it was like, yo, this guy is so stupid. I'm not going to empathize with him, like, at all. Like, it's dumb. So I wish they just would have had, like, I wish they just would have gave him a little more of an arc, like you said, like a journey that kind of went parallel to Spider-Man's, but they didn't.
I understand and I agree 100%. But on the more positive side with this one, because I'm very in between, I actually like all those scenes because it really, even during when he's like, oh, like, you don't remember me? Like, yes, we watch it and we're like, oh, but clearly this is a very, like, broken man, and he's like, now they see me. Like, he's hoping that somebody as awesome as Spider-Man would remember him, and that's kind of how I took it. And then when he's on the screen and it's him and he's like, now everybody sees me, and then it moves to Spider-Man, he wanted that attention and he has these powers, so of course he's acting like this. Honestly, my biggest issue is Green Goblin, is Dane DeHaan, which sucks because I love Dane DeHaan. I enjoy Dane DeHaan in a lot of stuff. I feel like a lot of these great actors just weren't given a lot to work with, is honestly the biggest thing, because we go into this film and we see, okay, they're childhood friends. They haven't seen each other in years, and then they build this connection immediately, and it just happens completely out of nowhere. So that was honestly the biggest takeaway I had, was it was a complete waste of this character, because if they were to do it in like 3 films, and or even just in these 2 films, and they introduced Harry Osborn in the first one, at least as like a friend, and they reconnected, and then maybe in between they spent that time building that friendship back a little bit, because I have people I was friends with when I was like 8 or 9. If I saw them, we might be like, hey, like, yeah, I miss you, like, what's up with life? But it wouldn't be this connection that they have, and it's just so unbelievable. So that's why actually the whole like Electro, Max Dillon stuff didn't even stand out, because the Green Goblin stuff I felt was so underdeveloped.
This movie had the exact same problem that Spider-Man 3 had, with like the too many parallel things. I feel like you're exactly right, Sabrina. I feel like if they would have stretched the Goblin stuff into a 3rd film, if all of his story would have been a 3rd film, and this film would have just been solely Electro, and then maybe Rhino is like a side character, and then just having that subplot kind of weaved into it, like the Harry Osborn subplot weaved into it, I think it would have been a lot more efficient. But
I think the temptation to do the death of Gwen Stacy was too great. I think
that's what they wanted.
That's what they wanted to do. That was the end game for this movie. And I also think that the mistake was, see, in the comic books, Norman Osborn was the reason she died. It was Norman. And Norman Osborn is a fantastic character, and Harry is a broken, tragic character. So for them to put everything onto Harry and to try to tell us that, well, Harry's going to have to hate Spider-Man for some reason. It's so stupid. It's so dumb. Then the Goblin formula being a thing. Then they hired Chris Cooper to play Norman Osborn, and then they killed him off screen after one scene. He's in bed. That was the biggest waste of a waste of a waste, to where I thought the reason they're doing this is because they did not want to repeat Willem Dafoe. They did not want to invite comparison to Willem Dafoe. We already did the Green Goblin. We already did Norman Osborn. Well, if you guys are telling us that this is a reboot and not part 5, then treat it like a reboot. And, have the guts to do the big bad, the same way that Christopher Nolan waited 1 movie, but then when he did his second Batman movie, Joker. We're going to do Joker. We're not just going to pretend that we can't do the Joker just because it happened in 1989. I know that was further away from 2002, but still, that is the biggest issue with this movie. In that regard, Sabrina, you're not wrong. The Electro stuff is almost fun. It's enjoyable compared to trudging through the Harry Osborn stuff, just to get to, he's going to have to end up killing or be the reason for Gwen to die. The other thing I like about Electro in the Times Square sequence, first of all, that sequence looked great. Secondly, it shows Spider-Man being a good hero character who can diffuse a situation more than the NYPD normally diffuses situations. It's Peter being like, hey, this is my buddy Max. I told you about him. You're not going to shoot. We're not going to shoot at you, Max. That's a beautiful little moment that makes the Spider-Man character look good. But I think that there's a bunch of different, this is what they should have done, this is what they should have done. I think ultimately if the temptation to do the death of Gwen Stacy, which for me, the actual short sequence in which it happens, and Andrew Garfield reacting, and everything that happens for a couple scenes after, like, that shit can move me to tears, no joke. That sequence and that powerful acting and that tragedy and her head hitting the thing, it echoes what was happening in the comic books, and it's frustrating because the compromise is I had to see this incredible moment in an otherwise mess of a movie, and it's just going to make it so that now the Marvel Cinematic Universe is hesitant to ever do that again. Like, I doubt we'll even see Gwen Stacy because it was already done in a movie in such a way that when like the same thing happens with Batman, and same thing happens with, you know, when certain movies in the past have done stuff pretty good, it's going to cause the studio not to ever want to try to redo it. And it's like, that's a shame, because it was only done maybe 70%, and it could have been more impactful if it's ever tried to be replicated again. But the Harry Osborn stuff, Dane DeHaan, I just think it was also the producers not knowing how to focus on other Spider-Man characters and look at other characters from the comic books, other characters he could have been friends with. Robbie Robertson's son, Randy, could have been a friend character that could come in instead of going back to, it just feels like the Sony producers remaking Spider-Man 1, 2, and 3. And they knew that in those movies, James Franco had such a large role. So at some point, Harry has to come into the story. I'm like, honestly, Harry doesn't. He's only a second Goblin. He's only a friend of Peter's in college, and, you know, but he has other friends. And Norman is the character that I think that they should have really put the effort into building up and redoing that in this world. And I think that would have been way more interesting.
Well, you know, I was going to say real quick, speaking of Dane DeHaan, coming off this movie right before
That's what I was going to say.
Yeah, he had Chronicle, you know, with our buddy Josh Trank. And then he had one of my favorite indie movies of all time, The Place Beyond the Pines, with Bradley Cooper and Ryan Gosling.
And yet, in this one, I feel like, I don't know, guys, maybe, am I wrong in saying, like, he might be the worst part of the movie? Sorry to Dane DeHaan. He's a great actor, but my God, like, his haircut with, like, he's got the emo Peter from Spider-Man 3. They brought that back. They were like, we're referencing Spider-Man 3. They got that. And his voice is like weird.
Yeah, he's supposed to look like this, like, very, you know, like, posh type of, like, wealthy kid who's, like, misunderstood and everything. And I feel like that's stuff that they could have explored through the relationship that was just so fast-tracked that we don't feel it, and we don't understand him as a character. We don't understand his motivations. Obviously, we know his motivations. He wants to survive ultimately at the end, but, like, but in life, we don't know him. We don't know his character pre this issue that he's going through later on in the film. And so that was the most underdeveloped thing to me. If they introduced, like I said before, if in, like, the first film, slightly in some small way introduce him as his friend, or push it out to the third film, something like that where this could, like, actually be impactful. I didn't understand it, and I didn't even know, as, like, an audience member, if I cared about him surviving. It's like, it's, you know, it's when we talk about really great villains and where you can really, like, empathize with them. Even though his motivation was to survive, I still didn't empathize with him in any of the ways.
Can I stay with you, Sabrina? Obviously, I just really feel like I need to switch gears. Before I forget, can we talk about the soundtrack in this movie, Sabrina? Specifically, I want to give you the mic because I know you have hot thoughts. All
right, real quick. Honestly, okay, the soundtrack from the first film, I understand it because I feel like it's stuff that he would listen to, like this Peter Parker. But the scene where he's sitting in his bedroom, which is also, I'll get to another point in a second, but he's sitting in his bedroom, puts on Philip Phillips, and he is like, he's like heartbroken about Gwen Stacy for a second, and then he's like, oh, I'm gonna find out what happened to my dad, and then it's all conspiracy, but Philip Phillips, and I understand wanting to use a relevant song in the film. I get it, like, this was a popular song on the radio, but it's not going to age well. Use something that fits the scene and is still popular and is actually going to age well. This was like an American Idol season 10 winner. No offense to Philip Phillips, you're amazing. No, you're amazing. But, like, this was the one song that he had, and it just, watching it now, when I saw it in the film originally, when it was still pretty popular, I was like, this is a really weird choice.
Yeah, it felt dated then. It felt dated at that exact moment. Right? Yeah.
Yeah, I was like, this is a weird choice, but whatever. And that's the thing. And also just that scene in general, because that goes back to the issue that I said earlier, because we're not really, I don't get his relationship with, like, Uncle Ben and Aunt May as well. It doesn't resonate as well because he's so focused on his parents. And that's even goes to show even more in this film. It really comes to play. And even Aunt May, no offense, but, like, she's in a scene and she's like, they have actually a really great scene where she's like, you're my boy. And I love that scene, but it doesn't really garner that much. It doesn't do too much for the film. It's one of those things where she's like talking about how she wants to be a nurse, and then we get that one scene where she's a nurse we know nothing about Aunt May at this point.
That's
We
what.
know absolutely nothing. After 2 films, we know nothing about Aunt May, and we know so much about his parents that doesn't really lead to anything.
Yeah,
It's like if they would have taken away all of the parent stuff and just gave all that, because like you're right, Sabrina, that scene makes me so. It made me so mad when I watched the movie, and it still makes me mad to this day because that is real acting right there. I feel like all of the moments that there was no CGI and there was no kind of big comic booky stuff. It was just the actors, just Marc Webb and the camera and just the set or whatever. It felt like real and human. It felt so real, and I feel like instead of focusing on that, they went with the conspiracy theories, the Dane DeHaan, Green Goblin, the cheesy Electro. Like they didn't develop any of that either. So it was just weird. Like they spent so much doing so little instead of doing. What do they say? Do you want to be a jack of all trades or a master of one? It didn't choose to be a master of anything. It tried to be a jack of everything and ended up being a jack of nothing.
But how did we feel about that Kid Cudi, Steve Aoki happiness when he's figuring out, I'm on the pursuit? That's great.
And he's wearing scuba gear.
Yeah. I think you guys are right. That scene that you mentioned, Sabrina, is one of my favorites of the movie, and it is sandwiched between the Dr. Kafka in Electro scene and some other bullshit, insane, crazy villain scene. And that's the perfect indication of what this movie is. And it's a huge bummer because there is real acting, and everything Andrew Garfield does in that scene in response to Sally Field is real, and she's got her lip quivering, and it's this beautiful moment. And then at the end of the film, when Gwen dies, I was reminded of this by doing some research on the movie. When Spider-Man drops down to see Gwen Stacy's body, apparently Andrew Garfield, and they'd been dating, they were dating at the time. Apparently Andrew Garfield hadn't seen Emma Stone in a couple of days, and they didn't do a rehearsal, and they started filming as he came in and just reacted to her being dead. And that bit of acting that Andrew Garfield does is heartbreaking. It is heartbreaking. And I feel that the other thing I want to talk about too is that if recently there's been discussions about, because of that amazing article and interview that John Boyega put out about his real disappointment with being a part of a big movie franchise, especially as it pertains to how characters of color are treated. I think that it's a different thing that Andrew Garfield went through, but I also remember the interview that he did with Amy Adams, where it was actors on actors from a couple months or years ago, and he talks about how disappointing it was, and she's like, yeah, me too, I'm Lois Lane. Yeah, how do you think I feel? How these actors sign up to play these characters, and they bring so much to it. But because of the needs of the studio and the storyline and the villains and the action figures and the Happy Meals and the soundtracks and all these different things at play, it's so difficult for actors like this to really be able to inhabit a role like this. Again, this is why the first Iron Man movie is like a miracle of a film. Because that first Iron Man has so much improv. It has so much Robert Downey Jr. and Jeff Bridges working shit out, figuring stuff out, and then they roll. And then, everybody who worked on that movie says it felt like an indie movie. So that movie should have been so much worse. And I just feel for Andrew Garfield because we mentioned how he talked about his relationship to the character as a kid. He was, in so many ways, the perfect guy to play this role. I wish they let the character not be in high school, but actually be Andrew Garfield's age and Emma Stone's age. And it's so disappointing to know that he put so much of himself into the scenes where he's allowed to do that. And he also, again, it was his idea to have that scene where he interacts with the kid and helps him with and it feels like it almost feels like a Patty Jenkins in doing Wonder Woman fighting for the no man's land sequence. And you hear that she had to fight for that, and you go, that seems like a no-brainer. That's the heart of the movie. And so knowing that Andrew Garfield had these ideas for his character and understood the importance and the responsibility and the significance of the character and is interacting with Sally Field, and it's beautiful, and he's interacting with Emma Stone, and it's gorgeous, and then for the movie to just be drowned out by all that other crap, it's just such a bummer. It's such a letdown. I will still, in my Spider-Man movie ranking, I still put Amazing Spider-Man 2 over 1 because of, I think I love the Peter Gwen stuff so much, and I love the costume, which I think is perfect, and I love the effects and the music and all these different things that I feel like when it's able to work, it feels more Spider-Man to me. Things are kind of popping more. The lows are definitely low, and in a lot of instances lower than the lows in the Amazing Spider-Man 1. But I look at the Amazing Spider-Man 1 overall, and I'm like, there's a bunch of highs in here, but they're not to me as high as the highs that I get when I'm watching part 2. So I got a lot of conflicted feelings about that one. Yeah, and the other thing too that I do want to mention that I know I was telling you guys about, like, my personal relationship to this movie.
Oh yeah, please tell.
First time I saw this movie in 2014, in May of 2014, was the first time I was 26 years old. It's the first time since I was a baby that I got on an airplane, having been born and raised in Southern California, and I flew to New York to see a friend. And so first time I got on an airplane by myself, flew to New York City, crashed on my buddy's couch, and during the day when he was at work, for like a couple days, like a long weekend, I just walked around the city of New York and got to inhabit the world that I have loved since I was a child. And the whole time I had my iPod and I was listening to the score to this movie. And then it's Friday night and I go to see the movie in Times Square with a bunch of New Yorkers. Oh, and so man. I'm seeing The Amazing Spider-Man 2 for the first time in this way. And I walked out of there and I walked right into Times Square and I was like, this is where he fought Electro. This is where he did that. So I have a completely nostalgic and sort of connected experience to this movie. And every time I watch it, and because it does feel this way already, but also I know that they shot so much of it in New York, I watch the movie and it feels like New York to me. I watch the movie and I feel like I can smell the piss on the streets. And I'm right back to the first time I visited my favorite city on the planet is New York City. So, yeah, I have a lot of, love for this movie while still having a lot of like that comic book fanboy compromise that we have been continually talking about. And to see this transition that these two movies had from what came before in the early 2000s to then what eventually became the pretty, I think, aware and sophisticated and really on it balanced, like Marvel movies and some of the newer DC movies, like to find that balance that Amazing Spider-Man 2 did not hit. It could not hit that balance. But Marvel movies today, they can be just as zany or zanier, like Thor Ragnarok, or like find the balance because they have figured it out and they know what they're doing.
Yeah, it's incredible, right? To think back. It's funny that you say 2014. I mean, think about all the movies that came out in 2014, Days of Future Past, Guardians of the Galaxy. I mean, even just that, Guardians of the Galaxy is enough to me to really think about the idea of these comic book movies reaching a different level. And the way the Amazing Spider-Man franchise, if it barely is that, considering that he only had 2 movies, goes out on a whimper with the Amazing Spider-Man 2 when it comes to everything they wanted to do and trying to cram that all in. And when it comes to the experience, like you said, Hector, his actors on actors, I saw that when it premiered live, and him saying it was such a sour experience and he wanted to do so much with the character and he was never given the chance. It's almost heartbreaking to see that, considering he was such a fan of the character. Yeah. And he wasn't given that shot to do something with it.
I hope that he knows, just him, and also like Emma Stone and everybody who was involved, like even Marc Webb. If I ever meet any of these folks, I will honestly, earnestly tell them, like, hey, your work in these movies was great. And it meant a lot to me when these 2 movies came out. And I so appreciate the hard work. And especially Andrew, like I would tell him, I'm like, dude, in so many ways, you are and I'm sure he gets this all the time, and I'm sure people are being nice as well when people walk up to him and they're like, you're my Spider-Man, you're my Spider-Man. But me coming from Tobey Maguire, that I always felt like was from an era of Spider-Man comics that I couldn't connect to. And then I get Andrew Garfield and I'm like, yeah, this is my dude. This is the stuff that I'm reading. This is the stuff I grew up with, and love Tom Holland. And I feel like he will eventually grow into that role as well, which is the beauty of how they've set up that whole world. But like, I hope Andrew Garfield does know that, like, man, I appreciate that you wanted to put that scene with you and Jorge in the movie. You know what I mean? And they could have named that kid something else, just to go back to the Jorge kid for a second, because in the credits, that character was played by a kid actor named Jorge something. That was a kid's real name. And I'm like, how typical would it have been of Hollywood to be like, your name's Timmy, or your name's like Johnny, or your name's like, Brent Jake. Or something, but Jake. But they'd let him stay Jorge. Like, that's so great, And Andrew has talked about this character before, where like the rumors were that he wanted his Peter Parker to like maybe date a guy and just be revealed to be bisexual. You know what I mean? Like he was somebody who understood that under the mask, anybody could be the mask, any ethnicity could be the mask. Like, he was always aware of that stuff, and really, and again,
he was pre-Into the Spider-Verse, right?
Absolutely, man. And the way he talked about the character, I'm like, I don't ever remember Tobey Maguire ever saying anything like this that ever made me like happy. I just remember Tobey.
Yeah, definitely not.
No, as great of an actor as Tobey is, I remember Tobey talking about the role in the sense of like, yeah, I love working with Sam Raimi, and I'm coming off of this movie like The Ice Storm, and I get to do this thing, and it's really cool. And
well, can I echo that? It almost seems, and I might be speaking on his behalf, and this is complete speculation, but it almost feels like that this experience that Andrew Garfield has, Sabrina, and I'm going to give it to you because you know more of his career than I do. I'm also a huge Andrew Garfield fan, but it seems like now he only exclusively does like indie, small budget, weird movies, and not any kind. I don't think I've seen him in any blockbuster since that. I mean, if you want to consider Heartbreak Ridge, what was that called?
Hacksaw Ridge.
Hacksaw Ridge. If you want to consider that a big block, but even that is like playing a completely different role than what he actually is in real life. That I feel like it's almost like indie-ish in the sense.
Well, it is pretty indie. It's super small budget. It's pretty small budget, 35 million.
Yeah. Well, I feel like every movie he's done since then, I feel like ever since then, he's like, no more big budget movies ever again.
Well, I can't imagine what it's like to have your heart broken because he's talked about it. And he also, I was actually going to say this when Hector was talking about it. He's kind of referenced Spider-Man in Under the Silver Lake, the David Robert Mitchell film. It's when they're in the bookstore, there's the Spider-Man comics. When he wakes up from a dream and like halfway through the film, he actually has gum on his hands and he has a Spider-Man comic attached to his hand. So it's like self-aware like references. Like I think he understands. I think he knows that. Like it's not on him. And I think people give him crap just because the movies weren't great. But honestly, I'm not gonna lie. Even as much as I was picking on it, of course, this is us discussing it. I really, really actually adore these films. I've rewatched them a ton. And I would consider him to be like tied with Tom Holland as my favorite. Actually, Miles Morales, Shameik Moore's first, of course. But in terms of the live action, him and Tom Holland are pretty equal to me. And then Tobey Maguire's just a little bit underneath. And I know this is the biggest hot take to everybody.
Yeah.
The biggest hot take. But at the end of the day, like I really appreciate the love that he put into it and his acting and his work in that. And it's just a shame, like working with big studios. And yeah, since he's done Silence, Hacksaw Ridge, Under the Silver Lake,
99 Homes.
Yeah, he has a Gia Coppola film that's coming out called Mainstream that just premiered at like a festival. But I think it's going back to that because he can really shine. I heard actually talking about the Gia Coppola film, some reviews came out and they said his performance is the most obnoxious performance they've ever seen in cinema history. And I'm so excited to see it. I want to see that. I want to see Andrew Garfield be completely unhinged. If you guys have seen Under the Silver Lake, he gets to like do all this crazy stuff and he's really working his talent. It's really getting those gears shifting. There's nothing stopping him. So I'm really excited for the future of his career. I enjoyed what he did with this one with what he had. So that's kind of my like final thoughts on it.
Yeah, I was gonna say I'm giving final thoughts in general.
yeah. We're picking apart like pros and cons, but I actually do really enjoy these. So,
RB3, any final thoughts before we close it out?
Well, also, I just love how much we were able to squeeze Under the Silver Lake conversation into today's episode. You can't go without it. I really enjoyed the first one. I gotta say I didn't like the second one at all. For me personally, it was. It's
probably at my bottom of Spider-Man movies, if I'm being honest.
Yeah, it'll probably be at my bottom. It'll probably be my bottom too. And I was just really disappointed by certain things in it, but I think there was a lot to be admired about it, and I do think. Andrew Garfield was underrated. I mean, even before Spider-Man, he already had major brownie points with me because of The Social Network, one of my favorite movies.
That's right.
So he already had those brownie points. There was nothing I felt like it definitely wasn't his fault, and I think he kind of walks away from it knowing that. Maybe he doesn't know that it isn't his fault, but I think the general audience knows that it wasn't his fault that the Spider-Man thing will work out. And you're right, Hector. I could have totally seen him in the MCU too. So I think he was great. I think, Emma Stone's performance and chemistry made the franchise all the more worth it. And I thought it was really great and human on a lot of levels. And I thought the parts that were a little more CGI based and all that weren't the best for me. But overall, again, I wish him the best. I hope that maybe there is a chance that maybe 10, 15 years down the line, the MCU has their own Spider-Verse kind of thing, and maybe he gets to walk on.
We have to do a cameo.
Yeah. Maybe he does a walk on. Maybe Toby. I don't know.
See that?
Yeah.
I've heard rumors.
I don't know, Toby.
Yeah.
If the MCU does a Tom Holland Into the Spider-Verse type like Spider-Verse thing, he has to show up. Him and Toby. It would be amazing. I would love that.
Yeah.
You think Tobey Maguire actually would though? I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. For the money, yeah, he totally.
Well, I mean, Sam Raimi's also doing Doctor Strange, right?
Go.
Maybe
Doctor
that's
Strange.
that. Maybe Sam Raimi give him a call. Listen, man, MCU money's good.
Watch Tobey
everything's
Maguire play. Tobey Maguire will play the bad guy in Doctor Strange.
good. Oh, I would love that.
That
I
would
would
be
actually
amazing,
really
right?
I
love
want to
that.
see that.
I would love that.
I don't think I want to see that. No.
I could see that though. I could totally.
I'd rather see Chiwetel Ejiofor's character.
Oh yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Hector, thank you so much for joining us, man. We really appreciate your time, your insight, your knowledge on the character and on these films. Your first plane trip to New York, 2015. That's incredible.
I've been on lots of planes since, don't worry. But I feel like ultimately rewatching these movies and being reminded about how they were made and why they made the certain decisions and stuff they made. I also like rewatched Ang Lee's Hulk a couple weeks ago and really enjoyed it. And I think it's because I'm at a point where like when these movies first came out as a fan, I had a lot more issues with them because at the time, that was it. That was the direction of these characters that I loved. So I'd be sitting there and I'd be like, okay, well maybe they can do this for Amazing Spider-Man 3 and they can do this and this. And if they do this character, then this and this and this. But now I'm like, revisiting these two movies, I hope too that if anybody's listening or watching that there is more good in there to discover, to rediscover, and that it's ultimately kind of harmless because these two movies are done. Do you know what I'm saying? They're not continuing with this direction, or they're not trying to build off of what came before. So they're interesting versions of the character of Spider-Man, and in a lot of cases, I think that Spidey himself, it's so well done, and the villains are so bad. But I think that they're good companion pieces to the Raimi movies, where I believe the opposite is true. I think the villains are so good, and it is tough for me to watch the performance and depiction of that version of Peter Parker. And then you get to Spider-Man 3 and Peter is pulling moves that I'm like, this is so out of character. This is so messed up. This is like Batman picking up a gun and shooting somebody and being like, I'm Batman. This is my mission. Like it feels so weird to me. What Toby was doing and what Peter Parker was doing in Spider-Man 3, nothing to do with the symbiote suit. I'm talking about how he like kisses Bryce Dallas Howard in front of people and then is mad that Mary Jane gets mad. I'm like, bro, what are you doing? Dude, what are you doing? So anyway, I would just hope that maybe people would give these another look and try and find and see some of that love that especially Andrew Garfield and Emma Stone were putting out, because I think that in many instances it's there. And I appreciate you guys letting me ramble for 2 hours. Thank you guys.
All good, man. No worries. Either way, where can everyone find you, Hector?
You can find me singing along for you. Yeah.
What was my dad planning?
Why is my dad dead? What happened? Find me. You can follow me on the internet on Twitter and Instagram at Hector is funny.
Yeah. Sabrina.
You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at SabrinaXMonica, and then also Sabrina on Film on Twitter.
RB3.
Twitter and Instagram at Director RB3.
And I'm at Squad Leader Race, guys. And obviously, make sure you have subscribed to First Cut if you haven't done so already. You can follow us on social media at First Cut TMO. For the Meaning of Podcast, I am Andres.
This is RB3.
I'm Sabrina.
And that was Hector. We are peacing out, guys. Peace out.